Hey folks, how are we doing today? Good. Excited for another day of AIS. Get to talk about some interesting stuff today. We're going to talk about cybersecurity and computer fraud. But first, let's talk a little bit about where we're at in the semester so that everybody knows where we're at. We are in week 12, which we only have two more lectures and one more NetSuite assignment left to us. So we are close to the end of the semester. That being said, it all kind of compacts at the end of the semester. We have a lot of stuff going on. So let's just go ahead and make sure everybody is up to date on the deadlines. Keep in mind, this is all in the syllabus. It's also on Brightspace. The reason I'm mentioning it now is I encourage you to do this before you get that 48-hour notice that this is due, because some of these things are pretty important. Next week, next Friday, we will have our exam two review, which means that we'll be done with our content. As always, my statement is review the study guide, make notes on it, and then make sure you've complete the practice exam before you come to class, because that's how you learn from the activity. That's also when your professional interaction is due. Professional interactions, if you've not already visited an event, there is one today immediately after this class over in the Innovation Lab. It's not part of the entrepreneurship series, I believe, but I don't remember exactly the top of my head. And then Wednesday afternoon at 4 p.m., we have our executive residents visiting. So two more opportunities. Um, Please make sure that you take advantage of at least one of them. I have had unfortunate situations in the past where somebody emails me late on Thursday night before something is due and says, Dr. Barnes, I still need to do my professional interaction. Do you have any suggestions? And I'm like, no. So I'm giving you the suggestions now. Please take advantage of them. If you can't do either of those two, then make sure you facilitate one before it's due on next Friday morning. Exam is going to be taking place the Monday after, so the Monday of week 14, we're leaving. We will have our results discussion. I do want to make a note of this. This last Friday, right before Thanksgiving break, I've already mentioned, my tradition is never to have class on that Friday. It doesn't always work out, but it probably will work out this time, so we will not be meeting as a class that Friday, unless you all just really do something wrong, like everybody decides to skip a class altogether. Maybe you have to do that in high school, like a senior skip day type thing. Yeah. If you decide to skip a day in between now and then I'll reschedule everything. So we will be joining to each other for Friday. But uh the results of good behavior, this class has been fairly well behaved over the course of the semester, so I don't anticipate that happening. So in all likelihood, we're at 99.8% likelihood we will not be meeting a class on that Friday before Thanksgiving. That being said, you do have an assignment due that Friday. That is going to be your AI research project deliverable 2. That's the result of your research and the work that you've done. So some pretty important stuff coming up that is due before you leave for break. You are more than welcome to submit that early if you don't want to have that on your calendar for that Friday. I expect that you'll probably be pretty busy the next couple of weeks with professors like me scheduling exams right before break. I'll be honest, I don't do that intentionally. It's just the way the schedule works out in some situations. We have 2 weeks after the Thanksgiving break, and that's when the exam takes place. Would you rather have an exam before break or after break? My assumption is you want to have it before because you got that lingering right after break. So I had in the past where students had to take an exam like the Monday they came back from break, and some not very polite comments on my evaluations in that situation. No, I'm just joking. They were actually pretty cool. Yeah. So we got Thanksgiving break after that, and the research presentations. I think I've already announced that I put a spreadsheet up with signups for when you want to present for research presentations. Please take advantage of that. If you do not sign up, then I will put you basically where there's a blank space. And historically, the early presentation dates have gone faster than the later ones. So if you want to get an early presentation date, you probably want to do that now. If you don't care, then you can sign up whenever. With that, that's kind of a summary of where we're at for the rest of the semester. So let's go ahead. Let's talk a little bit about cybersecurity and computer fraud. So, how many people have followed kind of this landscape of cybersecurity that's been happening here in the past few years? This is one of those things that is just exploded in I want to say popularity, but that's not the term I'm looking for. In a frequency of occurrence is probably the better terminology. We're starting to see a lot of trends in that regard, and there's a lot of things, a lot of concerns with respect to cybersecurity that we have to take into account. So we've already talked about it a little bit, and I mentioned it. So spring of 2023, Truman was actually hit by a massive cyber attack. I was actually in this room when it was discovered. We were actually doing an AIS class, and one of my students, who's now graduated from Truman State, says, "You need to shut down all the computers." And I'm like, "I'll do it when I finish my lecture." He says, "No, apparently there's a ransomware attack." So we were in the middle of the classroom when this became known. And so it was a really, really strange time. And that's kind of one of the pronounced areas of cybersecurity that we're concerned about now, with organizations very heavily interactive online and their networks being exposed. There's an incentive to attack. There's incentives to attack. One of the anecdotal pieces of information that I gave to my graduate class is how in one semester I gave them an assignment where they had to do some research on cyber attacks that occurred during that year. And I looked at some of the most pronounced cyber attacks, and it was 5 companies I'd never heard of. And then I did the same assignment the next year for more recent cyber attacks. All 5 of the cyber attacks were massive companies that everybody had heard of. So this is becoming more and more common at large organizations. And so we're having to take this more seriously. Now, some of the things we're going to talk about are very technical in detail, but this is a large area of research, a large area of interest that I think is only going to become more relevant over time. And there's some very simple takeaways that we can use in this particular area. I will say that even though I don't anticipate that most of the people in this room will be cybersecurity experts upon graduation, that you will have a lot more cybersecurity knowledge than the average person out there. And some of that, I would expect that to be the case now. Just having the exposure of understanding of what the purpose of dynamic passwords are and why we do two-factor authentication. It's really, they're important, even though they're inconvenient, they're important features to have. So this whole area of cybersecurity and computer fraud kind of falls within the purview of something called InfoSec, or information security. And it's a key technology issue in business accounting for obvious reasons, because we've talked about how exposed we are in this area. Just as a context, back in 2021, which was one of the big areas for cybersecurity development, President Biden actually held a summit on cybersecurity with the executives for a lot of organizations. And at the time, there was a pronounced shortage of 500,000, 500,000 cybersecurity professionals in the United States, which is just a massive amount. If you think about that, there's only like 350 million people in the United States, and they were short 500,000 cybersecurity professionals. So it's a lot of people. It just tells you the scope of the need for this area. And I think this has improved over time, but a lot of organizations were really, really exposed in this. Industries were particularly exposed. Healthcare in particular had a lot of problems. They said that 85% of healthcare industries or healthcare companies did not have a qualified cyber professional on staff. Now, you have to think about this in context. How many people in this room have paper copies of their medical records on hand? I was just gonna, oh, well, cool. I was gonna say, kudos to anybody who has raises their hand. I can't actually raise my hand because I don't have that. I do have stored local electronic copies, but I don't rely on my professional to hold on that. But what does that mean if there's a cyber attack? Like, say you're hit with a ransomware attack, your healthcare provider, and all of your medical records are deleted. Then basically all of the things that are unique about you, your medical history, all those things, they get lost. And so if you have allergies that you have to be aware of, or if you got specific illnesses that need to be treated, those are going to be starting back at ground zero. So very, very scary area to have a cybersecurity lapse. So information security is a critical factor in maintaining system integrity. The idea behind information security is very basic. If the functions of a system can be degraded or impaired by unauthorized manipulation, or that we can, if a user can perform the intended function of the system without being degraded or impaired by unauthorized manipulation, the system is maintained integrity. The idea being is that we want to be able to use our systems and not have to worry about whether or not our information is going to be leaked or whether the system itself is going to be shut down for some unknown factor. Kind of the example, again, that I'm always going to refer to in this area is the Truman attack, when basically we had to operate without technology for about a week. And then after that, we were on technology for a limited scope because we didn't know the extent of the cyber attack. That was a lapse in information security, given that example. So there are 3 critical components that we need to understand in maintaining system integrity or maintaining information security. So the primary focus of information security is the balanced protection of confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data. Now, these are not difficult words. I'm assuming that if I ask you to give me a definition of each of these terms, you could do this pretty easily. They're very, very common vernacular in the English language. But let's go ahead and go into them a little bit more depth, okay? Confidentiality: information is not accessible to unauthorized individuals or processes. This is one of those privacy concerns that we've talked about. One of the really most important areas of cybersecurity or information security and cybersecurity, has to do with make sure that information that's not supposed to be accessed by outside parties cannot be accessed. During the data breaches of the late 2000s and early 2010s, This is really problematic because some very basic protocols were not present. Does anybody remember the target data breach that occurred back in 2013, 2014? Yeah, well, that's the question I ask. And I say, if you did, that's impressive. Okay, I know. So 10 years ago or 11 years ago doesn't seem like a long time for me. It's probably a long time for you guys. But the target data breach, they had some very basic protocols missing, like storing computer or credit card information in an unencrypted form. In fact, if you ever look at your credit card, I'm not going to pull my credit card up and hold it up to the screen. I've learned better than that. Okay, but if you ever look at your credit card, you will notice that there's a microchip in a lot of credit cards now. In fact, it's pretty much commonplace. That is actually an encryption mechanism for your data, so it doesn't get stored in an unencrypted form on computer terminals. So that's one of those ideas that kind of goes back to the confidentiality information. We don't want people to have easy access to the detail. Then we got integrity. So I want to make sure information is accurate, complete. Obviously, a proper operation of the system can't happen if you don't have complete and accurate information. And then probably one of the more important ones is information systems are accessible on demand. This is a big area of cybersecurity that's become a lot more prominent in recent years, particularly with ransomware attacks and denial of service attacks, being able to actually use the system as intended. All right. So confidentiality issues have existed for probably the past 2 decades. These denial of service attacks and ransomware attacks, they've existed to some degree or another for about as long, but they're becoming increasingly prominent over time. All right, so what are some examples of information security threats? Well, this is not limited to, so you'll notice I say diverse array of threats, but not limited to, and then I list out about 15 of them. Okay, so first of all, you're going to ask, do we need to memorize this list, Dr. Barnes? The answer is absolutely not. But I do want to talk about a few of these because I think they're relevant. So you might want to take a look at these, and if you're not familiar with them, you may want to look them up. Some are pretty basic. I assume everybody in this room has heard of viruses before and know what virus. Virus is just a malicious software that's put on a computer without a user's knowledge. And it can be used to corrupt the system or to actually manipulate resources in the system or gather data. So some ones that are a little bit more fascinating to talk a little bit about, okay? So one of the ones that's listed on here that's really, got a long history of social engineering. Has anybody heard the term social engineering before? Social engineering basically is that you use manipulation of data to gather unauthorized access. Now, this has existed for a long time period. If you go back even like 40 years ago, 30, 40 years ago, this existed in computerized systems because a lot of systems were being encrypted and encrypted with passwords. But you know what users did with those passwords? They weren't like us and just kind of kept them as common space. They would put them on Post-it notes in their cubicles. All right. Can anybody see a problem with that? Somebody who's just trying to get information might walk through and say, all right, the Post-it note says here the password is chicken1. Okay, so I can now access the system through this user account. And you may say, that's a ridiculous password, Dr. Barnes. There was actually a recent cyber attack where that was the default password and users were not required to change it. So like about a quarter of the users on the system kept their password as chicken1. Chicken followed by the numeral 1, okay? Do not make that your password, by the way. That's a very easy one to hack. Do not make that your password. Go to at least chicken2 or chicken3, something like that, okay? Then we have data breaches. Data breaches have existed for a very long time. There's a long history of data breaches that have existed, and they still occur pretty much today. And that's just basically people who should not have access to data get access to the data. So we're really, really concerned about really private data and information such as credit card numbers. Those are the ones that are really widely publicized. There was a big data breach that involved TJX companies, which is like TJX, TJ Maxx, and Marshalls. That was like 95 million records. There was a Target data breach, which I mentioned earlier. It was like 11 years ago. There were 10 years ago, it was a Home Depot data breach. Probably the most recent notable one was a company called Alibaba. Has anybody have heard of Alibaba before? They're basically like the kind of the Asian version of Amazon. So anybody want to take a wild guess about what Alibaba's data breach exposure was? So just for context, Home Depot was a very large one at about 90 million credit cards and credit card numbers. What do you think Alibaba's was? It was 1 billion records, 1 billion, okay? Which is 1/8 of the planet right there. 1/8 of the planet was basically exposed in this data breach. That's just kind of an obscene number. So that's an example of data breaches. Then we have ransomware attacks, which I've talked a little bit about ransomware already, but ransomware is basically where you get access to a person's system, then you lock all the files in the system and say, you are not getting access to those files in the system unless you pay. And I will say, if you're interested in cybersecurity, there is a fantastic episode of Last Week Tonight that talked about ransomware. It's a bit dated. It's like 4 years old, but it's very interesting. I confess that I've got a little bit of a bias. I really enjoy Last Week Tonight, and it's very educational. It's supposed to be a comedy program, but they've got some interesting episodes, and that's one of my favorite ones. Talks a little bit about a grandma who got her basically her pictures and memorabilia locked in her computer, and she had to pay in Bitcoin to get them unlocked. And so it's basically a group of Russian hackers syndicate. It's fascinating. It's fascinating. It's terrible, but fascinating. All right. So yeah, some other ones that are kind of listed on here: phishing, cryptojack, internet things attacks. Okay, so IoT attacks. What are the Internet of Things? You've heard that term before, I'm assuming. So basically, Internet of Things is just kind of a common vernacular term for things that use the internet that do not need to use the internet. All right. So we've got common computers and mobile devices. Those are items that are connected to the internet and use it for specific purposes. But some more common ones, there's some more recent ones that have kind of come up, like thermostats, um, refrigerators. My air filter in my room actually has a connection to the internet, and I'm just kind of like, why? Why is my air filter connected to the internet? And I don't know why. I haven't figured that out. I think I made the joke. I don't know if I made it in this class. If I have, I apologize for repeating my jokes, but I made the joke in one class. Is like, I really secretly want there to be like a canister of poison in the internet or the air filter. So if somebody hacks my air filter, they can release poisonous gas in my room. Okay. That would be my fault for actually connecting it to the internet and letting it get hacked. But I don't know why the air filter has to be connected to the internet. It doesn't make any sense.
So that they,
Yeah.
wait 6 months and
Well, there's a blinker on the device that kind of says when the filter is problematic. So yeah, I can actually see it, and I'm around it every night for the most part. So yeah, it's just a really weird scenario. But so you can kind of see the problems with that. One of the interesting attacks that they talked about in the John Oliver video I mentioned earlier was the Internet of Things attack, where people were in their own homes and had their thermostats hacked, and basically they were locked out until they paid a ransom. So that's a serious situation. If I was in my house and somebody cranked up my thermostat to 99 degrees and I couldn't adjust it. Mine's not connected to the internet, by the way, and I never will connect my thermostat to the internet. But that's what I worry about. If it's connected to the internet, somebody hacks it, it's 99 degrees, I'd have to sell my house. Either that or burn it to the ground. One of the two. I'm not going to do 99 degrees for a long period of time. That's just too much. Too much. I grew up in Oklahoma. I suffered from my 100-degree summers there. All right, so a lot of things that we want to talk about. So how do we actually maintain some sort of integrity in this area? Well, there's some things that we want to talk about with respect to information security, two particular insights. So in addition to personnel training on compliance and operation policies, okay, and I don't want to overstate those because those are really pretty important, but they're straightforward. We do know the importance of things like passwords and multi-factor authentication. And I haven't really gone into depth on those, but those are pretty much given that those have to be integral to an organization's operations. If you don't have those, or more importantly, if you don't have people following those operations, it's problematic. So if you think about it, you probably should not share your passwords with other individuals. It kind of bypasses the purpose of that control. So that's one of those things that we make sure that we have in place. But we can actually incorporate two types of preventive controls that are generally utilized in IT systems. And you've probably heard of these before, but we're going to go into a little bit more depth because they are somewhat technical. First one's called encryption, and this is just encoding plain text information into a non-readable form or ciphertext for the purpose of data transmission or storage. So remember earlier I was talking about those credit card numbers just going down to the target terminals and being unencrypted? It's basically anybody who hacked into the terminal could read the credit card numbers the way that they were put into there, all right? Their credit was 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's not my credit card number, but yeah. Whatever the credit card number is was just readable that way. So encryption is an idea of disguising that information through some form. It can be simple or sophisticated. Some of the more sophisticated encryption mechanisms are 128-bit or higher, which are very difficult to decrypt without some sort of key. Then we have something called authentication, okay? Authentication. And so this is going to be the process of establishing the user origin of information or determining the identity of a user, process, or device. Now, authentication takes many different forms. And we've already talked about some very basic forms. Passwords are a form of authentication. User IDs are a form of authentication. Multi-factor authentication, so that thing that you have to use for DIR security, it has the word authentication in the name. But there's some ones that you may not have thought about, okay? Has anybody ever played a massive multiplayer online game like World of Warcraft or something like that? So the really sophisticated users, they get tokens on their phone, or they can actually buy tokens back before they were available on phones, where you actually have to enter a code when you log in, and it's a sequential code that's listed to something that's on the system itself. So you have to have that token in order to be able to enter something in. Biometrics are becoming increasingly more popular. This is something that I don't like using it as a proxy, but I will say it's very convenient that when I pull up my phone and I'm just kind of like, I just want to get in, I don't have to type in the code every time. It just recognizes my face. So that's an example of kind of a biometric device. We've also talked about biometric fingerprints, which my iPad operates off of, weirdly enough, instead of a face scan. But biometrics and I guess facial recognition would also fall in that category. And then identity questions, similar to the ones we had in NetSuite, are going to be a form of additional authentication. This is one, especially if we don't recognize the origin of the system, that would come up increasingly. There's also increasingly usage of geographic proximity. So if you get somebody who's trying to hack into your system that's in a different country, it'll recognize, say, you're not in your normal location. Normally, you're supposed to be in Kirksville, Missouri. Why are you logging in from someplace in Russia? And they'll try to ask those questions, try to make sure that you are in fact who you are. That's how that gets shut down. So a lot of authentication operations. I think we can all agree that they are inefficient and they take up a lot of time, but they're absolutely necessary because we want to try to prevent these cyber attacks from ever occurring. So let's go into a little bit more depth on encryption. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, I'm simplifying this as much as possible. What we're going to talk about is going to be very basic. If you were going to say, well, Dr. Barnes gave me expertise on encryption, that is absolutely not what I'm doing, okay? We're going to talk about this at a very basic level. If you go into the book and you start reading some of the details on encryption, there's some interesting inconsistencies in the way that the information is used. I actually added a couple slides to my presentation for this semester, and then I was reviewing them this morning and I deleted them. I was saying, yeah, this is just way too complicated. I was having trouble. I was having trouble making sure the details were consistent with everything, and there was a lot of inconsistency in the way that was presented. So encryption is going to be something we cover at a very basic level. The stuff we will cover, though, is going to be important and prominent and will likely be on the exam. So what are some factors of encryption? So we're talking about the key length. Usually it's going to have to be 128-bit or longer key lengths to secure data. So basically, the encryption is going to involve 128 bits of information that all of those bits have to be decrypted. More commonplace nowadays is 256-bit encryption, so twice the length. And there are, for really, really heavily encrypted systems, they go even longer to 512 or even 1024-bit. The algorithms we use, we've got symmetric key encryption methods and asymmetric key encryption. We're going to talk about those at a very basic level here in just a second. Suffice to say that those are going to have some very, very basic analogies we use to understand what those operate on. And then key management. Who actually has the key to the encryption? We actually need to make sure that there are very strong policies in place in the organization for key management. Otherwise, information security not be held. So let's go into the details of the types of key encryptions, the encryption algorithms. There's going to be two basic ones we're going to talk about. So there's symmetric key encryption. Now, this is probably, I shouldn't say probably, this is the most powerful and fast of the two types that we're going to talk about. It is far more costly to implement. Usually it's only used within an organization. It's not used externally. It's very uncommon that it's used externally simply because of the cost associated with that, for internal communications and transmissions only. So what you need to understand about this is that we have an original data or document, and this is encrypted in the organization using a private key, one of those encryption keys that we talked about in the previous slides. So then you have an encrypted item, and it's decrypted by using the same private key. So everybody has to have the same key in the organization. Everybody has to have the same item to be able to decrypt. So if I encrypt an item, I send it to you and you're in the organization too, you have to have that same encryption key to be able to decrypt that item. There's no flexibility in that. So that's the only way to decrypt this document. The way you should think about this, the analogy is like a padlock. So if you look at a padlock, you can't have multiple keys that can unlock the padlock. You have to have the exact key. Now, I know that there's a lot of YouTube memes out there about how padlocks can be easy unlocked using padlock hacks and out there. I'm talking about the general intention of a padlock. You have to have the key. You may say, well, I could hack that padlock. I said, you're talking about cybersecurity attacks right there now for my analogy. So keeping in line with the original intention of it, you have to have the exact same key. There could be multiple copies of the key, but the key has to be identical. The keys have to be identical to one another. Contrast that to asymmetric key encryption. Now, asymmetric key encryption is slower, but it's actually suitable for outside of communications with other parties, okay? It's generally used for external communications and transmissions. So how does this work? We have the original data and document, and then all of the receivers for the document have a general key, what's called a public key. So the receivers basically all have the same database, which is used to encrypt the item. So everybody has the same public key that's used for decryption, but the decryption process has a unique key that's unique to the individual receiver. So the way to think about this is going to be a ATM card. Okay, so think about how your ATM card works. Everybody that's at your bank probably, or not everybody, but most people at your bank all have the same ATM cards, a similar ATM card, and they can go to the same device to receive cash. They can go to the same ATM machine. But your ATM card carries a specific code that only you know and only you can use, and that has to be paired with the card itself, that 4-digit PIN that you have to put in. So you have to have the same item that everybody else has, but you have to have a unique code to be able to access your account. All right, so that's kind of the analogy. I will admit this is not a perfect analogy, but I think that's one of the best analogies you can come up with when you're talking about trying to use a unique identifier for a broad array of information. The key to understand here is that for the encryption step, everybody has access to this public key. Everybody in the that's could receive it, but the decryption has to occur using the specific private key of that user. That's going to be the key to understanding that. No pun intended. Now, going to a little bit more depth on encryption and authentication. So modern communication privilege information frequently employs both asymmetric key encryption and authentication to further increase security. Now, the natural question is how is this? And my answer is really honestly, I don't know. Okay. I'm not an expert in this area. I don't tend to test to be an expert in information security. I'm learning this oftentimes as much as you all are. I have some knowledge in this area, but how does this technically work? You're going to have to go to YouTube to look on the videos. But how do we talk about it at a very basic level, at a very high level? Let's talk about some of the concepts that are related here. So hashing utilizes an algorithm to ensure what's received in a file is identical to content to what is said. So you probably heard the term hashing. There's common hashing algorithms that basically are used for encryption purposes. The idea being is that it's very similar to encryption, but it's not reversible. Okay, it's a complex algorithm. This gets used very, very frequently in cryptography. In fact, we're going to talk about this next week when we get into talking about blockchain. And the idea being is that you have to have a very specific algorithm to be able to unencrypt something or to be able to decipher something. I shouldn't use the word encryption because they're not the same thing. But the hashing algorithm has to be identical. And if you don't have the identical hashing algorithm, you can't actually open the file. You can't actually open the document that you're trying to identify. So one of the big things about hashing is that it's very similar in concept to encryption, but encryption can actually be unlocked reversing it. Okay, if you have the means and the power, computing power to do it, you can eventually break an encryption code. It's very, very difficult to do that with hashing. It's scales of magnitude much more difficult for hashing. So it's not really reversible in the same context. Also, encryption and hashing can be used together in creation of digital signatures. All right, so digital signatures is an additional authentication device that basically verifies the identity of who's sending the file. Now, how does this work? I put a slide in here that goes into detail, and if you want to spend some time looking through the slide and learning about it, I encourage you to do so. This is not going to be on the exam. I barely understand this, so I don't expect you to have a working understanding of this. Again, I tried to go in a little bit more depth. I added additional slides, but I eventually threw them out because I said this is just too much. Okay, this is really, really complex material that only very technically savvy people understand. You may have there's entirely likely you have a better understanding than I do. So all I really want you to know is the understanding of the conceptual terms here, that we use encryption hashing jointly together to create digital signatures, which are used for identification purposes. I also put a link in here if you're just interested in going into it, talking about how digital signatures operate. It's a link through the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Service Agency of the U.S. government, which is the organization tasked with cybersecurity. All right, so let's talk about something that's a little bit closer to home. Okay, so we're going to go into a little bit more depth into something that I am familiar with. So we're going to talk about this thing called Cressy's hypothesis. So this is a sociologist. His name is Dr. Donald Cressy. And in 1953, he wrote the following statement. Trusted persons become trust violators when they conceive of themselves as having a financial problem which is non-shareable, are aware this problem can be secretly resolved by violation of the positional financial trust, and are able to apply their own conduct, situationalization, verbalizations that enable them to adjust their conceptions of themselves as trusted persons with their conception of themselves as users of entrusted funds or property. Now, that's really, really complex detail. It's really, really complex conceptually. But we can break this down into ways that are going to be a little bit more meaningful. So here's what I want to do is I want to look at these underlying phrases and see if we can simplify these a little bit more effectively. So first of all, having a financial problem which is non-shareable. Has anybody been in that situation where they've kind of had financial stress? I mean, you're college students, so I can think it's got kind of an ongoing situation, but Just been kind of like, okay, I'm not sure how I'm going to be able to afford this or how I'm going to pay for this. That kind of sucks to be in that situation, right? You say that's kind of a stressful situation. What's a way that we can characterize stress? We can characterize it through an incentive or a pressure. Okay. You can characterize that through an incentive or pressure. Now, normal people experience this all the time, but we talk about something that's very addictive. That's where these incentive or pressures tend to escalate. Is anybody familiar with somebody who's got a gambling addiction or ever heard about somebody who's got a gambling addiction? Yeah. So this is an area that's becoming increasingly more prominent, and there's some interesting dialogue to be having here, especially with sports betting as it occurs in the state of Missouri. Sports betting is currently illegal in the state of Missouri, but there are ways to bypass that. That's not me incentivizing you to bypass sports betting, by the way. I'm just saying that that's something that's a big area, and it very interestingly enough, it is very appealing to college age students. I can't figure out why. I guess there's a lot of students who are really interested in sports, so who knows? But yeah, I've had some interesting conversations with the past college students who are very big on sports betting, and they take a part of that. But that can become a very addictive area. And if you do that and enjoy it for entertainment purposes only, and you got it under control, kudos to you. Okay, if you're one of those people that's spending more money that you don't have, you might have a problem. All right. So that's something we talk about in gambling addiction. Substance addiction is another area. So there's a lot of different areas here. Financial pressures that are opposed to, like, say, for example, that you've got a Neil family member that's not you can't afford medical treatment. That could also be an example of an incentive or pressure in this area. These are all things that kind of contributes to this concern about that. So next area is going to be, this problem can secretly be resolved by the violation of position of financial trust. So you're in a position where you're like, I need money, whether it's to fuel my addiction or whether it's to actually make payments on something that I need to actually have. Whatever it is, you need money, and you realize that whatever is set up in your job, you have the ability that if you violate your position of financial trust, you can answer your problem. In other words, if you steal from your employer, you can actually have a temporary answer to your issue. All right. This is called opportunity. Can be construed as opportunity. So a very big concern area there. And then finally, are able to apply to their own conduct, situation, verbalizations that enable them to adjust their conceptions of themselves as trusted persons. So somebody puts you in a position of trust. All right. They put you in a job and they say, I'm trusting you with the assets of this organization. Please do not betray my trust. And you are saying to yourself, all right, I know that I'm a trust position, but for whatever reason, I'm going to violate that trust. And you try to justify that. Okay. That's called attitude or rationalization. And this is commonplace in areas where you see the concept of fraud. And we can characterize this as something called the fraud triangle: incentive, pressure, opportunity, and attitude or rationalization. So how many people have ever heard of the concept of cheating in classrooms before? I'm not saying that you've ever done cheating. Don't raise your hand if you do that. Okay, that's a bad idea. Okay, but we've all heard about stories about cheating. Could you actually use this triangle to actually figure out why people cheat? Think about it very basically in this classroom. Okay, so you're in this class. You really need an A in the class because you've been struggling in other areas, and an A would go a long ways to doing really well towards your GPA. And you can put that on your transcript and or on your resume, and you might get a better job if you get an A in AIS. Okay, so you really need A. Can we characterize that as a pressure or an incentive? Yeah. All right. What about the opportunity? You're in the middle of the class, and Dr. Barnes is playing on his iPad instead of paying attention to what's going on in the exam. So you could just slip some notes out, and he's kind of like saying, oh, that's right, custody, authorization, and recording. Yeah, I remember him saying that now. I just kept remembering car for some reason. Yeah. So you can actually slip out those notes and do that. So me not having effective controls over the exam. Can we say that that might be an opportunity for you to cheat? Okay. Yeah. So yeah, that'll be it. And then finally, the attitude of rationalization. Why would you cheat in my class? Dr. Barnes is such a good guy, except for all those times that he makes jokes that are not relevant to the class itself. Okay. Or that he dresses up as the father of accounting and expects people to laugh at his lame humor. Yeah. And I'm just like, yeah, Dr. Barnes not really teaching the class. He's mostly putting up memes and expecting this, like a stand-up comedian instead of an actual instructor. Yeah. Kind of a justification for why he's not a good instructor. He's not teaching me this stuff, so I can go ahead and I can justify cheating in his class. So this is kind of very common, something we can actually see here. It doesn't take a lot. Now, very interesting point to note. Very interesting point to note. If those three conditions, if any one of those three conditions don't exist, will fraud occur? Will cheating occur in this classroom? Like, let's say, for example, you're a 4-point student and you don't have any incentive to try. It's like, I'm going to graduate regardless. I've already got my job offer. If I get a B in the class, oh well, whatsoever. Are you going to cheat in the class if you have no incentive or pressure to do so? What if I watch you like a hawk? Like I've got cameras in every room. I got cameras in the corners and I'm just watching and I'm recording everything you're doing. Are you going to cheat on the exams? Probably not. More importantly, I think this is the perspective everybody takes. Like rationalization is just not worth it. Okay, it's just not worth it. There's no real reason to do it. Okay, if one of those factors doesn't exist, then fraud can occur, which is an important point to make. So we want to make sure that we try to control that to as much as possible. Now, logically speaking, in an organization, which one do you think we have the most control over? Say you're responsible for trying to implement controls in an organization that prevent fraud from occurring. Are you going to focus on incentive or pressure, opportunity or rationalization, or attitude rationalization? Well, can you control if somebody has an addiction? Probably not, not to a great degree. Okay. Can you control if somebody thinks you're not a good person and they just want to do something to hurt you? You could be a nicer person, I guess. Quit telling lame jokes and wearing really, really weird costumes. Okay. I guess you could do that. Okay. But what is the most likely area of focus? Opportunity. Okay. We've already talked about that with respect to controls. So let's talk about how we can actually characterize fraud and what it is that we can do to prevent those things. So according to the Institute of Internal Auditors, common computer frauds include the theft, misuse, or misappropriation of assets by altering computer readable records and files. Okay. So actually taking information from the systems and using that for your own. So some of that may be a little bit more innocuous and innocent. Say, for example, that you want to send out a whole bunch of you get an offer from a marketing company that says we just need email so we can put this address to our mailing list. And so, well, my client's got a whole bunch of user records. I could just copy the email addresses and give them there. Can make it easy, $100. Yeah, that might be a problem because people don't want to be added to mailing lists. I hate being added to mailing lists, and it still happens despite my unsubscribe behavior constantly. Okay, doesn't matter what happens. Some of this could be a little bit more nefarious. Okay, that's somewhat innocuous. You know, you think there's no real harm in doing something like that. What if you're stealing people's credit card information or their social security information, setting up fake accounts in their name? That might be a little bit more direct. What about theft and misappropriation of assets by altering the logic of computer software? So instead of diverting money to an account that might belong to the organization, you divert money to your own bank account. Is that kind of something that could happen if you have enough access to the system? Yeah, absolutely. Theft or illegal use of computer readable information. So actually setting up information that reads or having information that reads computer identification and that information and then stealing that or using some mechanism to steal it. Theft, corruption, or illegal copying, intentional destruction of computer software. So utilizing software that's not yours or destroying that software purposes of denial of service. Or the theft, misuse of misappropriation of computer hardware. This one's probably a less likely one. In fact, this one I would say is probably the least concerning. And we tend to think about this as saying, well, computer hardware is very, very expensive and difficult to replace. But interestingly enough, when I worked for KPMG, the long term is like they were not concerned about whether or not my laptop console got stolen. They were more concerned about whether or not the information on the laptop was exposed to some sort of corruption or to some sort of breach, because the information is far more valuable in the long term than just the computer hardware. So this one's a minor one, but the ones above, any exposure to private details or private information, whether it's proprietary or customer-based information, that would be something we'd be very concerned about. So what are some fraud prevention techniques we can use in this area? Well, first of all, fraud risk assessment should be performed by management. We already know this. We talked about this in controls last week. We said entities risk assessment is very important. Why? Because if you don't know what the risks are, you can't implement controls effectively. So making sure that fraud risk assessment in the area has occurred. So what exposure, what area of weakness exists. Also, oversight of internal and external auditors is really important by the governance. Usually that governance mechanism is something called the audit committee. Now, we're not going to go into too much depth about the audit committee, but you do need to know that they're a subset of the board of directors, which is a representative group of the shareholders of the organization. So they have specific oversight of the auditor work. So internal and internal and external, not internal and internal. I'm losing my mind today. The communication and training of employees to make them aware of their responsibilities. Now, this is probably the most important one and the one that goes without being said, and it probably should be said a lot more. If people in an organization do not understand their responsibilities, or it's the importance of their responsibilities are not conveyed to them, they may not take them seriously or even do them at all. All right. This goes back to that COSO framework that we talked about last week. By the way, what are the 5 components of the COSO framework? Yeah. Remember those. Remember I said that's absolutely something that's gonna be on the next exam? Yeah. It's like, we're not ready for the final exam yet, Dr. Barnes. I promise we'll know it for the final exam. Yeah. Control environment, entities risk assessment, control activities, information and communication and monitoring. That information and communication step, that is conveying those responsibilities to the necessary stakeholders to know this is your responsibility area, take it seriously. If people don't take it seriously, then that's where problems occur. Some things can be very, very simple, like don't write your password down on a post-it note and post it in your cubicle. That's exposure just waiting to happen. Some of that's a little bit more detailed, like making sure that you don't pass your password off or don't assign responsibilities to somebody else in that area. So like a very easy segregation of duties problem might be, well, I'm responsible for authorization, but I'm going to be out of the office today, so I'm just going to give my password to my coworker so they can go ahead and record the transaction and then subsequently authorize it. Kind of defeats the whole purpose of segregation of duties if you just share those passwords and that person can actually authorize any transactions they want. So make sure that you communicate the importance of these responsibilities. So what do we know about this? This is prevention. So these all represent kind of controls over this area. Are preventive controls sufficient by themselves? Probably not. We only have got 3 categories of controls. We have preventive controls, and what are the other categories of controls? Detective and corrective, okay? So we want to make sure that we also have controls in those areas. Let's talk a little bit about detective controls in this area. So business process evaluation by internal auditors, making sure that we review the processes that were in place and try to identify any gaps. Transactional level of analysis of data to determine the effectiveness of internal controls and indicators of fraudulent activity. This would go back to those data analysis techniques we talked about a few weeks ago. If we notice abnormal trends in the data, it might indicate that fraudulent activity is taking place. And then continuous monitoring of the transaction activity. So this is going to be something very similar to the monitoring mechanism we talked about before. If we notice that problems are occurring, we may need to revise our controls to address those problems. The last thing I want to talk a little bit about is I want to talk a little bit about system availability, okay? So this is something that's a little bit a subset of those controls, but is a little bit more broad and more general in context. So a key component of IT service delivery is making sure that data is available when needed. And there's 2 ways we can approach this, and these are not necessarily these are not mutually exclusive to other. These can exist together. So there's going to be both preventive mechanisms and corrective mechanisms. So let's talk a little bit about what these represent. So first of all, preventative or preventive, whichever one term you want to use. I use preventative for this one. But preventive mechanisms with respect to system availability. A very basic one would be an uninterruptible power supply. Has the power ever gone off wherever you live before when you're working on your computer and you just start using very, very, very vulgar words because you're very frustrated? Happens to me all the time, okay? Happens to me quite frequently. I used to actually have a battery charged terminal that I connected my computer to. So when the power went off, my computer didn't immediately shut down. I actually had a few minutes I could shut it down manually. Now the problem was is the thing was really expensive to maintain or replace the battery in. I found that out. I was like, yeah, I'm not really worried to risk it. Plus, we've actually got backup mechanisms of the computer. But for a system like Truman State's infrastructure system, the power went off at Truman State's campus. They'd want to have a uninterruptible, wow, I can't say that word, uninterruptible power supply to make sure that the system doesn't go down when the power goes down. Next, we have fault tolerance, okay? Fault tolerance is a fancy term for basically making sure that if an individual components fail in the system still operates. So you want to have a hardware infrastructure so that if pieces of hardware fail, that the whole system can continue to maintain. So there's going to be some sort of redundancy within the system that can actually maintain it. Then we have virtualization and cloud computing. We're not going to go into a lot of depth on cloud computing, but this is a mechanism that's really, really good for preventive measures because if the system itself gets corrupted, at least you have data stored in this alternative location. Now, what happens if the cloud gets corrupted? That's a completely and totally different story. We try to make sure that we have redundant copies in multiple locations. Now, on the other side, with respect to corrective controls, we have disaster recovery planning, okay? This is a tool for restoring IT data access, okay? Information technology and data access, excuse me. Information technology and data access. So the system goes down, we try to actually make sure we have a plan in place for making sure it goes up as quickly as possible. So we're turning it back to operating condition, all right? And then we have business continuity management, okay? So this is keeping the business operational when the system itself is down. So example of this might be at a restaurant. If the restaurant's cash register or the computerized systems go down, can a restaurant still operate? Yeah, like think about Greek corn gyros. Could they still continue making gyros if their cash or computerized terminals went down? Yeah, they still cut the meat off the kebabs and they write up a ticket and they hand you that and they take the cash. They probably can't do credit cards, at least not through a computerized terminal system. Maybe manually if they've still got those scanner things. Has anybody ever done a manual credit card read? Man, those were the days, okay? That's where they actually use carbon copies and have you copies of that. Man, I'm reminiscing way too much today. All right. So that's good as an example of what we will do for corrective controls. So again, make sure you understand the fundamental difference between preventative controls and corrective controls in their operation. This makes sure that if a problem occurs, that it doesn't interrupt our operations. This one, if the operations do get interrupted, we get them back to functioning as quickly as possible. And that's it for today. We'll see you all on Wednesday for our final idea assignment.